The British intelligence agencies have been watching Russia closely for decades, and since the Ukraine war started, they've got their finger on the pulse of the Kremlin, or at least that's what they want us and the Russians to believe. Only last night, the head of the British intelligence agency, GCHQ, said Putin doesn't know what's going on because his closest colleagues aren't telling him the truth. But is all of this disinformation? My next guest says no. Christopher Steele thinks British spies do have a good idea of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and he should know because for many years he was one of them. He joins me now. Chris, thanks so much for joining us on the show. Before we start to talk about all things Kremlin, let's kick off with Vitaly Klitschko and that interview. You just watched it. What did you make of him?
Thank you for having me on the programme, Beth. Delighted to be here. I think people like Vitaly Klitschko will be remembered for decades, if not centuries, as the real heroes of this period of our history, and of Ukraine, of course. And a remarkable man, incredibly brave, living in a city which is under siege, which he's possibly being targeted for assassination. I think we absolutely have to take our hat off to him.
He smiled and didn't answer that question, but you think he will have been targeted for assassination without doubt?
I think originally when this operation was underway, yes, definitely. So
a man that really is risking his life every day. Let's get on to the Kremlin and intelligence. So Jeremy Fleming, the boss of the GCHQ, said Putin has made a strategic miscalculation. He said this in a speech last night, launching this invasion. He said his advisors are afraid to tell him the truth. Is that your assessment too?
I think that's part of the problem that you have in an authoritarian system, where there is definitely not a premium on passing bad news and real news back up to the leadership. However, I think there's a more fundamental point here, which is that Russia has always had bad intent in terms of rebuilding its empire and dominating its neighbours. And it's never had the capabilities to match that. And I think the big mistake that Putin's made in this situation, of all the mistakes, and there are many, is that he believed that Russia had the capability to fulfil its intents towards Ukraine, and it doesn't.
And had an ability to do that quickly, and that hasn't happened. And I guess my next question for you is that has clearly caused discord in the Kremlin. The Russian defence minister vanished with heart problems. What's going on? Are they all fighting each other?
Churchill once said that studying the Kremlin was like looking at bulldogs fighting under a rug. You couldn't quite see what was going on, but you could hear the growling and the snarling. And it is very much like that. And one of the problems we've got in assessing Russia over the years is that it's not an open society. It is a complex society. The leadership is not uniform, is not monolithic, but it is suppressed and the divisions are kept behind the scenes.
The FSB, the Russian intelligence services, though, presumably they are leaking information to the Ukrainians. Is that partly why the Ukrainians are fighting more effectively? Is that partly why people like Vitaly or President Zelensky, despite having been on Putin's hit list with mercenaries in the capital, that they're still alive? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that Ukraine and Russia are like England and Scotland or England and Ireland, and that many Russians are of Ukrainian origin and vice versa. They're incredibly close, these people, and therefore the thought of destroying your cousin's house and home and cities, and after all, Kiev was the first capital of the Russian state, is pretty horrendous to a lot of Russians. And I suspect loyalty in that situation is very complex and difficult.
Today, the UK's military chief said that while he expects the coming weeks to be difficult, that in many ways Putin has lost. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I don't see there's a way back for Putin, and I think this is one of the big problems that the West is going to face going forward. I don't see how we can trust Putin in any sort of peace deal that comes now, and I don't see how we can deal with him in terms of normal business going forward. After all, the President of America has called him a war criminal.
If you can't trust Putin, though, in any peace deal, how does it end? Because presumably it has to end with some sort of deal. I mean, Zelensky's talking about neutrality and a referendum. I mean, how does it end if you can't trust anything he does and you can't negotiate?
I think it does end in a deal of some sort. But I think that deal is some way off, and I think it probably doesn't include Vladimir Putin.
What do you mean by that, Chris?
Well, I think he may well be pushed aside out of the top leadership, or even possibly assassinated by his own people. The point is that we've gone over a watershed here. I don't believe there's any way back for Putin. I can't believe he can be rehabilitated in the international community. And that's a big problem for us going forward.
It also means he has no incentives to stop fighting.
I think that's true, unless, of course, they start losing on the ground. And one of the remarkable things about this situation now is it does look as though the Russian army, at least in some areas, is being defeated.
And just finally on this, Tony Radakin has said Putin failed to anticipate the unity and cohesion amongst free nations of the world. Are you worried that this Western unity would crack if Donald Trump returned to power in the US?
Well, that's not an immediate prospect, actually, in this situation. There's at least another 2 to 3 years before there's a presidential election in America. It certainly wouldn't help. I mean, whatever one thinks of Trump, he was much more of an isolationist than other US presidents. He questioned NATO's existence and solidarity, and the EU, and all the institutions that stand up to Russia were put into question by him.
And Chris, you're a Russian expert. You've studied and gathered intelligence on the Kremlin for many years. You now run a private business doing something similar. Were you surprised when Putin invaded Ukraine?
I was surprised at the scale of the invasion. I wasn't surprised that there was a military operation or a political operation to recognise the breakaway republics as independent. But I had calculated, and others had calculated, that the logistics of this didn't add up. Right. That if you cannot keep down a population of 43 million people using only 150,000 troops, it doesn't work.
So poor intelligence from the Russians?
I think poor advice. I think poor intelligence in terms of what I think Putin was being told, which was that parts of Ukraine would welcome the Russian troops with open arms, and there was a shadow governance structure that could be brought in to replace the current government.
And you said in your submission to the 2018, this is the Intelligence and Security Committee within Parliament that look at matters of national security, you said that Russia was becoming more aggressive, that it was moving from an authoritarian to totalitarian state, and that Putin had to be tackled. Was the West asleep at the wheel? Are we partly to blame for this?
Yes, we are very largely to blame for it, in my view, some of which is perhaps understandable. After 9/11, for example, there was an attempt to draw Putin into an anti-Islamist alliance, anti-terrorist alliance. That failed. But I think subsequently to that, the problem has been that the West has been naive about Putin and very slow to react to his rogue state type activity.
And on the issue of how the West has reacted to Putin, I want to ask you a bit about the relationship between the UK and Russia, and about oligarchs and money, Russian money in London. In the UK for years, you were monitoring Russia and the misdeeds of its spies, like murdering people in the UK. And yet you also saw British politicians and businessmen, they'd go into parties and holidaying with oligarchs. Do you think that the establishment here let themselves get seduced?
Absolutely. I think there were the two things going on there. One is an element of naivety, because many of the Russians who come to London are very urbane, very convincing, very sort of westernised. They don't represent the real Russia, if you like. There is a dark side to Russia, which not many people understand. Sadly, I've been studying it for the last 20 years. But I also think, in addition to that, Russian money, a wall of money that hit London, it wasn't just Russian, but it was Russian money first, I think, sort of set up a lobby, a group of interests who serviced this elite, who the lawyers, the estate agents, the PR firms and so on. And it became a pretty important part of our economy. And I suspect also in terms of investment and so on, particularly after Brexit and what have you, when we were looking for other forms of investment in the country. This golden visa scheme, which is now so controversial and in retrospect was such a bad mistake, grows out of that problem.
And there is one person that's particularly been talked about lately, which is Evgeny Lebedev. You said in an interview with Sky last October with Sky News, it was curious Mr Johnson, Boris Johnson, had enabled the son of a KGB officer. Now, it's important that I make it clear Lord Leverett is a British citizen, has broken no laws, has condemned the war in Ukraine and strongly denies any insinuation he's sympathetic to the Russian government. But his elevation to the laws has been controversial. Would you like to see the intelligence reports around the decision to make him a Lord and put him into the House of Lords?
Yes, there's a parliamentary procedure involved here, which is quite complicated, and I do understand need for confidentiality and so on. But this is such a controversial appointment, and the story out there is that it was against the advice of the security services. So I think it's a pretty exceptional case. And there was a debate in Parliament the other day, and I think probably the outcome of that should be more transparency about how this decision was made.
You have some experience. Would you think that that has credibility, that the security services would have been anxious about this appointment?
I think any sort of family member of a former KGB officer or a KGB agent, and actually Lebedev is not the only one. There are quite a few former KGB officers who are quite prominent in Britain and in business here, who need to be very closely looked at. And certainly it's surprising to me that they've managed to operate in this country in the way that they have.
Well, it is now changing, of course, with these huge sanctions against a number of different people and companies. Can I now bring you just to the world of spies? Because is it fair to say that people are right not to trust intelligence sources? It's often disinformation. You often use anonymous sources. Yet we're all expected to be reverential about British intelligence. Do you accept that you offer us no truth or proof in anything you say?
I think that's an exaggeration. Clearly, intelligence work is as much an art form as it is a science. And what you're trying to do in intelligence work always is to test out a piece of information, get it from different sources, get it from different types of sources. I think that actually the calling out of this invasion by Western intelligence has been a remarkable operation. And I think that the decision to preempt, to make intelligence public in this situation, to preempt Russian activity, has wrong-footed the Kremlin quite a lot.
That was interesting, wasn't it? Because what happened was things like the invasion, the planning of it, then, you know, the threat of chemical weapons. What's happened is Western leaders who would typically keep that all private have been shouting about it and making it public. What's the tactic of doing that?
It's the information warfare. I mean, the reason that intelligence often isn't made public is obviously because of the need to protect sources and techniques. And every time you make a piece of intelligence public, you are taking certain risks in that regard. However, in this situation where you're dealing with a strategic threat, the invasion of a European country by Russia, the decision was obviously taken that that risk was worth taking, and I think it's paid off.
But it's fair to say as well that British intelligence officers would also deal in disinformation as Russians would, right?
It depends what you're talking about. I mean, if you're saying that we should be spreading disinformation to Russian troops on the battlefield in Ukraine, probably yes. If you're talking about disinformation about our own society, obviously not.
And Chris, how does this end? You've said that you think that Putin, there's no way back for him, that there would have to be some sort of regime change in Russia, although how that could happen, still pretty opaque. Klitschko said in that interview that he was worried, or he warned Europe, the rest of Europe, that there is a danger that this tips into a wider European war. Do you agree with that? Are you fearful about that?
Yes, I think people talk in terms of this being like Munich in 1938, 1939. It's probably equally threatening in terms of 1914, where we sort of slipped into war by various mistakes and smaller countries provoking bigger countries and so on. So there's always a risk that something like this can spread. And, you know, the Poles are very robust. They've talked about having Ukrainian fighter aircraft in their country or provided from their country. So it's very important that NATO remains united. Everyone sticks to the same script. Everyone sticks to the same rules about this in order to prevent this conflict spreading.
OK, Chris, I've got more questions for you, but I have run out of time as ever. Thank you so much for joining us